Hi everybody, as we continue on our journey through Romans, I thought it would be helpful if again we had a look at some of the concepts, words or themes that appear in the letter, things that Paul talks about, and if we're going to understand the letter as a whole, we need to understand what exactly Paul means when he uses particular words. Today I want to talk especially about the word salvation. What does Paul mean when he uses the word salvation? We've already dealt with a couple of passages that deal with that word. In chapter 1, verse 16, Paul talks about the gospel of which he is not ashamed because it is the power of God for salvation. What does he mean by that word salvation? I remember when I was 14 years of age, I was saved. It was at a mission service at our church, and I went forward and prayed a prayer, confessed my sins, and after that I understood that I had been saved, which meant that my sins had been forgiven, that Christ had taken the punishment for my sins that should have been mine, and that because I had accepted that idea that Christ had died in my place, I was now saved, which meant that when I died I wouldn't go to hell. I wonder if that's what Paul means when he talks about salvation. Does he even mean that salvation is something that primarily happens for an individual, to an individual? Most biblical scholars would suggest that when Paul uses the word salvation, he has something in mind more than just individuals who make a decision for faith, and because of their faith they are saved. Saved from sin, guilt, saved from God's judgment and punishment. Most biblical scholars would say that Paul's perspective, Paul's horizon, is bigger than that. Some have argued that when Paul talks about salvation, he's primarily talking about something which is experienced communally. He's talking about how the Gentiles are saved as well as the Jews through Christ's sacrifice, through Christ's self-giving on the cross. That salvation is something that happens to us as a group. I think there's truth in that, but I think that even that point of view is too limited. Again and again, Paul talks about salvation in terms of the whole creation. That Jesus came into the world in order to redeem the whole of creation from the power of sin and death. That through his dying on the cross and his rising again, he overcame sin's death-dealing power. The whole creation is redeemed. As Paul says in another place, every knee shall bow, every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. Paul talks about the whole of creation groaning as it awaits its redemption when the sons and daughters of God are revealed. God's purpose is to save everything God has made, the whole of creation. Now, creation needs saving so far as Paul is concerned because sin has entered the world and corrupted everything. I talked last Sunday about sin with a capital S, a power, an influence at loose in the world that is opposed to God's good purposes and which leads to death. Sin is death-dealing. It kills people, but it also kills the environment, it kills relationships, it kills communities. Sin leads to death. God's purposes are always to give life. So when Paul talks about salvation, he's talking about saving us from this death-dealing power of sin, delivering us from sin's power, a power that has corrupted everything, even God's good law, so that we are able to live. Paul talks about our salvation as being something that is happening rather than something that has already happened. It's not until all things are redeemed that we will finally be fully saved. But in the meantime, we are saved inasmuch as sin no longer exercises ultimate power in our life. That power is now exercised by the Spirit of God that dwells within us, setting us free from the power of sin, free to live in ways that please God and are according to God's purposes, and also free to participate in God's redeeming work in the world. So when Paul talks about salvation, he's talking about more than just individual people being saved. He's talking about more than just communities or groups of people being saved. He's talking about everything, the whole creation, being saved from sin's destructive power, being redeemed, healed and made new. So when we see that word salvation, the salvation that flows from the good news of Jesus Christ, keep in mind that Paul is looking at the big picture, the salvation of everything that exists. I hope you tune in again on Sunday for our next session in Paul's letter to the Romans. I hope that you have taken the time to read the epistle through in full. And if you haven't, I hope that you're about to begin to do that. If you have, I hope that you will now go back and read those first 3 chapters again. I've mentioned several times that Romans is a difficult letter, but it repays careful reading. So I look forward to seeing you all on Sunday. Thank you very much.